Hey guys, this is Simon from Massive Awesome. In this video I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the core gameplay for Shattered Earth. Now, Shattered Earth is a 32mm tabletop skirmish game. It's playable with a very small number of miniatures, anywhere between sort of 4 and 6 in a basic small scale encounter, all the way up to something like 12, 14, 16 miniatures for a much larger scenario based encounter. In this particular gameplay demonstration we're just going to play with 2 miniatures just to keep things simple. So we have here a Coyote Assault Trooper from the United Nations of Mankind, very much a ranged attack specialist. And over here we have an Acolyte of the Dragon from, of course, the Cult of the Dragon. And essentially that's the opposite of the Coyote Assault Trooper. The Acolytes are much more melee focused. So we're just going to play out a very simple gameplay turn. We're going to give the Coyote Assault Trooper an activation, and then if the Acolyte survives, we're going to give the Acolyte an activation, and take you through a very basic combat example. So Shattered Earth is a D10 based game, which is why you'll see a bunch of D10 on the table. It's a decimal system. It means the maths are very straightforward, and we use dice pools in this game. So all that really means is that instead of rolling 1 or 2 dice, you're actually going to be rolling more like 10 or even 15 or 16 dice in some cases, if you have a particularly powerful miniature on the table. Most tests in the game will be an opposed test, and that means that both players will roll their pool of dice. And what you're looking for is a fixed target number on each of those dice. The target number for Shattered Earth, for all tests in the game, or all opposed tests in the game I should say, is always 7. So you're just looking for a 7 or higher on any D10, and every roll of a 7 or higher counts as a hit. And what you're going to do is both roll your dice, count up how many 7s and higher that you've got, and then compare the total. And the person with the greatest number of hits wins that opposed test. If there are any modifiers to apply to a particular test, the target number does not change. All we do is either add dice to or subtract dice from the pool. So again, there's no complicated maths to work out on the tabletop. If a particular ability says that you add 2 to a ranged attack test, you simply take 2 more dice and add them to your pool. That's it. The only other type of test that you will need to make is what's called an attribute test. Now, an attribute test is simply performed on a single D10, and all we're going to look for is the attribute value or lower. So if you have an attribute of 5, you need to roll 5 or lower on a single D10. That's it. Again, there are modifiers that can apply to that test, and the modifier, whether it's +1, +2, +3 for example, will add to that base attribute. So let's say our base attribute was 5 and we had a +2 modifier, that would modify that attribute to 7, therefore we're looking for a 7 or lower on a D10. The only thing to point out when we're making an opposed test is that on a D10, any roll of 0 is classed as a critical hit. That actually counts as 2 hits. But that's the only other difference. Otherwise, the value on the dice is exactly what it is. Right, let's get right to it. So in this turn, I'm going to activate the Coyote Assault Trooper. And when you activate a miniature, you can perform any number of free actions and 2 standard actions. Now, free actions, generally speaking, are granted by special rules or pieces of equipment or invocations that a model may have access to. Standard actions are generic actions that are available to all miniatures. And standard actions are things like move, attack, jump, charge, all the basic things that you need to do to effectively play the game. So in this case, I think the best thing for this Coyote Assault Trooper to do is actually try and take a shot against that Acolyte, because we don't really want to get any closer to them, and if we get any further away we might be getting into range penalties for our ranged weapon, so we're going to stay exactly where we are. The first thing to do, I think, we're going to measure that range. Now in Shattered Earth you can measure anything at any point in the game. We believe that gaming should be about tactical play, strategic planning rather than guesswork. So we allow you to measure anything at any time. So what we're going to do is measure the range. Now we're going to measure from the front of the base to the front of the Acolyte's base. And we are about, let's see there, 11 and... exactly 11 inches. So, we're 11 inches away. Now, ranges in Shattered Earth are a little bit different to perhaps some war games that you've played. We have semi-realistic weapon ranges, which means that at this scale, most weapons, in fact pretty much every ranged weapon in the game, would make an effective kill shot anywhere on the board. Even if it was a pistol firing from one corner to the other, you could still make an effective kill shot with that pistol. The difference is that some weapons are much more effective at longer ranges than others. So in the game, whenever you see a range stat for a weapon, what that actually represents is the range increment of that weapon, not necessarily the maximum range. And all we say is that, yes, you can use that weapon to shoot anybody on the table, but for every multiple of that range increment, you're going to suffer a penalty. and it's always just a simple -1 penalty to your dice pool. Very, very straightforward. In this case, the assault rifle that the Coyote Assault Trooper is using has a range increment of 12 inches. We've just measured to say that we're in 11 inches, so we don't actually suffer a range penalty. So, we're probably going to shoot, but actually for the first action, I think I'm probably going to aim, because as I said before, I don't want to get closer, I don't really want to move out of range, so I'm going to stay exactly where I am. I'm going to take my first standard action to aim, and my second standard action to shoot. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is add 2 attributes together. Every model has a number of different attributes. They're all the same. The 4 basic attributes are physique, agility, mind, and defense. And again, you can see these on the stat card example that we are showing on the campaign page at the moment, the one for Lieutenant Mitchell Ward. And those 4 attributes are the basic physical and mental characteristics of a particular miniature. There is then a 5th attribute, which is extremely important, and that's called prowess, or your pro attribute. Now, prowess is just a shorthand description of how effective a combatant that particular miniature is on the tabletop. And whenever we make an opposed test in the game, what we're going to do is add 1 attribute to the prowess, and that gives us our basic dice pool. And again, for all basic attacks, in the attack profile itself, we actually list what that pool value is, so you don't actually even need to perform that calculation. So, how do we shoot with the Coyote Assault Trooper? We're going to take his agility and his prowess and add them together. So the Coyote Assault Trooper has an agility of 6, so we will take 6 dice, and a prowess of 4, so we will take another 4. And that forms our basic dice pool. That's 10 dice, basic dice pool for a ranged attack with the assault rifle that he's going to be using. Now, we said we were going to aim. Now, aiming grants you a +1 to your ranged attack test whenever you aim. So we're going to take another dice and simply add that to our pool for 11 dice. However, that's not all. The Coyote Assault Trooper has a trait called Expert Marksman. An Expert Marksman says that every time this model aims, it may add an additional +1. So effectively, you're getting +2 from the aim bonus instead of the original +1. So we're going to take another dice, and that gives us our final pool of 12. Now, the only other thing we need to pay attention to, we've already checked the range and we know that there's no range penalty, but it looks like that Acolyte is going to get some cover bonus from being close to that terrain. Now, the way cover works in Shattered Earth is there's 2 different types. There's either soft cover or hard cover. And cover is generally granted by the type of terrain that the model is next to. And all we say is if the model is within 1 inch of that piece of terrain and the terrain is in their front arc, they will get a benefit from that cover, regardless of the angle that they're being shot from. So even if they were being shot in their rear arc, they would still get the benefit from the cover. And the reason that is that it's not so much the person that's firing at them crossing over that cover, but we're trying to simulate a slightly more cinematic feel for the game, where the model wouldn't simply stand there and be shot at. What they try and do is take cover next to any particular terrain or features that they can. So in this case, for example, we see here that the Acolyte is actually behind this particular piece of terrain. If we were being shot from this angle, they would still get the benefit from this terrain. For example, they might hunker down next to it, they might dive down in this little crack here and try and gain some cover from the terrain that they're in. In this case, the terrain is within the Acolyte's front arc. They are within 1 inch of it. We're going to call this hard cover because it's a rock, and hard cover grants +2 defense to that particular Acolyte. So I don't need to worry about that as the activating player when I'm shooting, because what we wanted to try and do with Shattered Earth is make sure that you as a player perform your own calculations and then your opponent performs their calculations. So you don't necessarily need to ask the opponent what their particular attributes are or any particular modifiers to the test. All you would need to do in this case is both agree that that miniature is in hard cover. You don't need to worry about that, as I said before, so your pool doesn't change. So what we're going to do, we'll move this out of the way, and we are going to roll those 12 dice, and we are looking for any roll of 7 or higher, with any zeros being a critical hit. So let's see what we get. Okay, so I can already see a couple of criticals and some 7s. And there's also a lot of 1s and 2s there as well, so let's count them up. So we've got 1, 2, 3 normal hits, 4 normal hits I should say, and then 2 criticals, so 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we've got 8 hits overall. So what I'm going to do, just to remember that, I'm going to put another 2 dice over there, just to remind me that that particular miniature has scored 8 hits on the ranged attack test. Now normally when you perform an opposed test, both players will roll the dice simultaneously, but as there is only me here, I need to remind myself of how many hits I've scored, and then I'm going to roll for the Acolyte. So when you're defending against an attack, again it's 2 attributes. In this case your defense plus your prowess. So the Acolyte's defense is 2 and their prowess is 4. So our basic pool is 6 dice. Now you can already see that it's much harder to defend against being shot at than it is to do the shooting in the first place. However, we said before that we believe that Acolyte is in hardcover, and hardcover grants a bonus of +2 to your defense. So what we're going to do is take another 2 dice and add them to the pool. There are no other modifiers for this particular miniature at this time. Again, if there were, we would simply add dice to or subtract dice from the pool. So we have a pool of 8 dice for the Acolyte to try and defend. So I'm going to try and roll them over, actually I'll roll them here. And we're just looking for 7 up and any zeros or criticals. So what have we got? 1, 2, 3 hits and a critical, so 5 overall. So let's take another dice to remind me and we'll put those here. So the result of that ranged attack test, the Coyote Assault Trooper scored 8 hits, the Acolyte scored 5 hits, which means that the Coyote has scored 3 net hits overall. If the Acolyte of the Dragon had equalled the same number of hits or exceeded it, then the Acolyte would have successfully defended against that ranged attack. As it is, however, the Acolyte has unfortunately been shot. And the way that damage works in this game, there isn't a separate damage roll, it's all calculated out of that first opposed test. So we have a difference of 3, and that difference is generally referred to as being net hits. So we say we have 3 net hits overall. For every net hit you score in an attack test, you do 1 point of damage. Now again, there are some modifiers that apply to that. Particular weapons might have a trait called brutal damage, which means that for every net hit you score, you actually double the amount of wounds caused. And there are different damage types as well. In this case, this is a physical weapon which does physical damage, so it's simply 3 wounds caused to that Acolyte. Now, there is an armor value in the game, but the way that armor works is that it simply comes off your wound profile. So again, if you look at the Lieutenant Mitch Ward stat card example on the campaign page, you'll see that the first few boxes are a different colour to the remaining ones on the wound track. And all that means is, for any standard weapon, any non-armor piercing weapon, the first wounds always come off the armor before it actually gets into the wounds themselves. The difference is that you can heal wounds in this game, but you can't actually repair the armor. So once the armor's gone, it's gone. In this case, the Acolyte has 1 armor, so the first wound comes off their armor, and then we do 2 actual wounds to that particular Acolyte. So we would mark 3 boxes off on the Acolyte's profile. However, the Acolyte has a special rule that allows them to potentially ignore the first wound caused every time they're attacked. And that rule is called high pain tolerance. And all that high pain tolerance says is, if you make a physique attribute test and you're successful, you get to ignore 1 of those wounds. So we've done 1 point of damage to the armor and 2 wounds. So I'm going to take another d10, and as I explained before, an attribute test is a simple roll of 1 dice equal to or under the specified attribute. So the Acolyte's physique is 6, so I need to get a 6 or lower on a d10 in order to ignore 1 of those 2 wounds. So let's see what happens. Well, so I actually rolled a 0. Now, when you're making an opposed test, 0 is good because it represents a critical hit and you score 2 hits for that. However, on an attribute test, a 0 is an automatic failure. So unfortunately, in this case, that Acolyte is going to take 1 point of armor and 2 wounds. They are still alive though, so we now get to activate with them. So let's clear up these dice and let's see if we can enact some payback on the Coyote. So I think now that when we activate the Acolyte, what I'm going to try and do is get into close combat with this Coyote. I don't really want to stay at range, even though I'm in cover at the moment, because if that Coyote rolls as well as it did last turn, I'm going to take another 3 wounds, and I can't survive that. There's only 2 wounds left for that Acolyte. So we've got no free actions to perform. There's nothing we need to do at this point other than get into combat with that Coyote. So, as I said before, each miniature has 2 standard actions that they can perform. And for my first standard action, I think what I'm going to try and do is move out of this terrain. Now, normally when you're moving through terrain, it's what we call rough ground in the game. It will halve your movement. So the movement of the Acolyte is 5 inches. If I were to just walk across that rough terrain, it would actually be reduced to 2.5 inches. So I don't really want to do that because I don't think 2.5 inches is going to get me close enough to be able to charge in that Coyote. What I'd like to try and do is get over that terrain if possible. And the way that I get over that terrain is by jumping. Now, normally when you jump, you can jump half your movement value, in this case 2.5 inches, but if you do so, you ignore any terrain or intervening models. I don't think that's going to be good enough because that's exactly the same as if I started just walking through that terrain. If I perform a physique attribute test and I'm successful, I actually get to jump my full movement, which is 5 inches. So if I measure 5 inches towards that coyote, that actually gets me just the other side of those rocks. So I'm going to see if I can make a physique attribute test to do that. So as I said, for my first action, I'm going to jump, and let's see what happens. So I needed a 6 or under, because the Acolyte has a physique attribute of 6. I rolled a 3, which means it's a success. So I'm going to go ahead and jump the Acolyte 5 inches to the other side of that particular rock there. Now then, I have another action left, and for that other action, I think what I really want to do is charge into that coyote and smack him in the face. So let's see if we can do that. So I have a movement of 5. I also, though, have a different ability on my profile called Impulse. And what Impulse says is, I get an additional 2 inches whenever I charge. And that's represented by these little wing blades on the back of this Acolyte. It just gives them a little extra boost of speed. So we're going to see how far away we are and see if we're actually within 7 inches, because obviously 5 inches of movement plus the 2 inches from Impulse gives me 7 inches on a charge. So let's see where we are. I think, I don't know whether you can see that, but that is exactly 7 inches to the coyote, which is almost as if I'd worked it out previously. Right then. So I think what we're going to do is charge straight in with the Acolyte. Now melee ranges in this game are usually 1 inch. You don't have to be in base-to-base contact. You can actually stop 1 inch away. Some weapons, some miniatures have weapons with a much longer range, 2 inches for the most part. In very rare occasion you may find something with 3 inches, but that's only for very, very large models with a particularly big weapon. In this case, this is a standard humanoid figure, and they only have a 1 inch melee range, so actually we're going to stay 1 inch away from that anyway. In a lot of miniature war games, whenever you charge, the rules for that charge will be included in the charge description themselves. If you jump, you would have rules for jumping, for example, and those rules would all be separate. In Shattered Earth, we have some very basic rules for those particular actions that just explain how you perform the action. But in order to give us some additional flexibility, what we've included is a number of different status effects that modify the play. So one of those particular status effects is going to come into play now, and that's called momentum. Now, a model gains momentum whenever it performs a jump or charge action. So we'd have got momentum from jumping when we move from here to here, but we'd also get momentum again for when we charge. So at this point in time, that particular Acolyte has the momentum status. And what momentum means is that the rules description simply states that when a model has momentum, it gains +1 to attack, to melee attacks, and -1 to defense. So it gives you a little bonus for smacking people in the face, which is what I'm hoping to do in a minute, but it gives you a penalty for defense because you're charging in recklessly. Now, we could have very simply put those rules in the charge description, but that meant that you would only get those particular bonuses if you charged, and we wanted Shattered Earth to be a very free-flowing, flexible system. So when we separate those rules out and we put them in a status effect, it means that any other time that status effect is granted, those rules apply. So for example, even if I didn't charge, let's say there was a building here, so if we put one of the miniatures up here and one down here, and I was to jump down to attack that particular miniature, even though it's not a charge, I would still gain momentum and therefore get the bonus to the attack. So it's, again, a very, very flexible system that allows you to string together rules and status effects to perform, effectively, combos. So, we've charged into the coyote, and let's see what the outcome of that attack is. So, a charge action allows you to move up to your movement in inches. In this case, we get the additional 2 inches from having the impulse trait. And after that charge, if you have come into engagement range, which is simply the little 1 inch halo around the miniature, if you come into engagement range with an enemy model, you may make an attack against that model. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So, the Acolyte of the Dragon, to make a melee attack, we simply use Physique plus Pro. So the Acolyte has a Physique of 6, so we're going to take 6 dice, and a Prowess of 4, so we're going to take another 4 dice for a basic pool of 10. Now, as I said before, this miniature has momentum at the moment, and momentum gives us +1 to a melee attack. So I'm going to take another dice and add 1 to the pool. The Acolyte of the Dragon also has a special rule, which is called Aggressive. And Aggressive works very similar to aiming for ranged attacks. Aggressive simply states that whenever this model has momentum, it gains an additional +1 on melee attacks. So we do have momentum at the moment. I'm going to take another dice and add it to the pool for a final pool of 12. So let's roll these and see if the Acolyte can dish out some punishment to the coyote. So I've got 1 7 and 2 7s, and that's it. That is a very poor roll. There are a lot of 1s there. So I've got 2 successes overall. I don't think the Acolyte is quite going to do it at this point. So let's move these dice out of the way, and we'll make our defense roll for the Coyote. Now the Coyote, again, it's simply defense plus pro. It has a defense of 2 and a prowess of 4. I'll take another 4 dice. It also has another ability called combat training. Now this is unique to the Coyote Assault Troopers. They are not particularly melee combatants. However, through combat training, they're used to being charged. They're used to being attacked in close combat because most enemies want to close in on them. So they have specialised training to deal with that. And combat training simply gives them +1 to defense whenever they are charged. So in this case, we have been charged. We're going to get an extra +1. So I am going to be rolling 7 dice to defend against those 2 hits that the Acolyte scored on their melee attack test. So let's see what happens. And I have successfully defended by rolling 2 successes. So the Acolyte scored 2 on the attack, the Coyote scored 2 on the defense. It's a tie, but the tie always goes in favour of the defender in these cases, so the Acolyte failed to do any damage to the Coyote. Now normally that would be the end of the combat round, but because the Coyote is still standing, no damage has been done to it, we get to the combat resolution phase. And in the combat resolution phase, we have 2 choices as the defending model. We can either choose to continue attacking in combat, and we actually get the opportunity to strike back now out of activation, or we can attempt to disengage from that particular miniature. Now in this case, in a long-term fight, and if I'd have rolled average dice, the Acolyte would have done some damage to the Coyote. So let's say the law of averages plays out. I think in combat, that Acolyte is going to eventually win out. I don't get to use my assault rifle in melee combat because it's a long-range weapon. I do have a pistol, which I can use in melee combat. However, I'm going to be suffering a penalty on that because it's still a ranged weapon. And what we say is, for a ranged weapon, it must have the point blank trait, which allows us to use it in a melee engagement, but we suffer -2 on that particular test. So what I can do is actually work out the odds. So it's going to be a ranged attack test for the Coyote. So I will get agility plus pro, which is 10. But I will be suffering a -2 penalty for using the pistol in close combat. So I'm rolling 8 dice. Now the Acolyte gets to roll 6 dice on their defense test. Pro plus defense is 6, but they're at -1 because they have momentum, so they're on 5 dice. So actually thinking about it, if I'm rolling 8 dice as the Coyote and they're only rolling 5 dice to defend, and remember that Acolyte's only on 2 wounds, I'm going to try and shoot it in close combat with a pistol. I think that's probably my best option at the moment. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So let's put 5 dice over here for the Acolyte, and then I'm going to roll 8 dice for the Coyote. Again, 7 up we want. So I've got 1, 2, 3 regular successes and a critical hit. So that gives me 5 net hits, or 5 hits overall. We'll roll the Acolyte and see if the Acolyte can defend. And I have rolled 1, 2 hits. So we're going to cancel those out, which leaves me with 3 net hits overall for the Coyote, doing an additional 3 physical damage, which is enough to kill the Acolyte. Now I could make my high pain tolerance roll to ignore one of those wounds, but I actually only have 2 wounds left, so even if I make that roll, I'm still going to die. So unfortunately, bye-bye, the Acolyte is gone. Okay, that's just a very, very simple example of how combat plays out in Shattered Earth. Pretty much everything else you do in the game will involve making opposed tests, rolling really satisfying handfuls of dice, comparing those hits against each other, and working out the outcome. Both players will roll simultaneously, they're always active throughout the game, there is very, very little downtime, and because of our status-based rule system, you can string together different rules to perform very, very complex combos, even though the actual core mechanics are really straightforward. So I hope you really enjoyed that. I hope that gives you an idea for how to play the game. I would urge you to download the alpha rules, which are available in the gameplay section of the campaign page. We have the full 1.2 alpha rulebook available to download, which includes all of the basic rules, plus 5 example scenarios for you to try out. And then we have model profiles for the United Nations of Mankind, the Cult of the Dragon, and the Deathless. And they are all the Wave 1 miniatures that you can see available on the campaign page. We have profile cards for them. So please download it, play with proxies, give the game a go, string together some combos, and let us know how you get on. Thanks for watching. We'll speak to you soon.